Hello, class, and welcome to this lecture in counseling families with alcohol and other drug issues as we explore a little bit of systemic assessments and genograms today. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie. So I'm really excited to have you all here to dive into this really crucial aspect of family therapy that combines both analytical tools and an understanding of the dynamics within families. So, to kind of get us started off, I want you to just think about your family for a moment, both your immediate family and your extended family. And I want you to consider how your family is structured. Who's the key figures in your family? How do the relationships within your family influence the different dynamics that you observe? Are there patterns? Are there roles or traditions that stand out to you? I want you to just think about that. And where did these roles and these traditions come from? Where did the hurts in the family come from? Where did the dysfunctions come from? Everything comes from somewhere, and oftentimes we inherit these things. Or we simply catch ways of doing things from previous generations. And so today we're going to kind of dive in a little bit into the foundational knowledge of systemic assessments and genograms, because these are tools that are really vital for understanding and working with family systems in a therapeutic context. So in today's lecture, try to divide it up into three central themes. The first one is just the overview of systemic assessments. What are they and why are they essential in family therapy? And we'll learn a little bit about some tools used to assess family dynamics and their strengths and limitations. We'll then dive into our second theme, which will be genograms, which is a very powerful tool used in family therapy. And we'll explore the history and development of genograms, how they differ from traditional family trees, and how we can construct them. And that will be important for you as you come into your genogram assignment later on in the course. So you'll want to pay special attention to this. And you'll learn some basic symbols and structures and techniques used to represent relationships and gender and generational patterns within the family. And then we'll take a little bit of time and talk a little bit about how we apply these genograms. We'll look at identifying intergenerational patterns, understanding the transmission of behaviors, and considering cultural contexts within a genogram. So we'll cover some ethnic considerations and how to interpret genograms to formulate hypotheses about how families are functioning, and then developing some strategies for interventions within the family system. Now, I want to introduce you to a very important person in the field of family therapy and cultural sensitivity, and that is Monica McGoldrick, born in 1944. She did her undergraduate work at Brown University, where she studied psychology and social sciences. She then went on to get her master's in social work, and has really developed a strong career in developing the educational foundations for how we approach family therapy. She began her career during a time when family therapy was evolving very rapidly, and there were a lot of new theories and practices. She was strongly influenced by systems theory and by Murray Bowen's family systems theory. And her work in different cultural contexts and considering cultural and ethnic factors really kind of drove her, based upon her influence by Bowen, to develop some groundbreaking work in the use of genograms. And this really, she kind of emerged as recognizing that traditional therapeutic tools were really often insufficient to capture all of the rich, complex, and multi-generational narratives of families. And so she wanted to develop some tools to help families and therapists figure out what's actually going on, being able to visualize and analyze patterns across generations so that everybody can understand and be conscious of the different influences of culture, of history, of social factors. And so the genogram really is a tool that has been primarily used to map family relationships and health histories. And it was transformed under McGoldrick's guidance into a comprehensive method for understanding intergenerational patterns, as well as belief systems and emotional processing within families. She developed a seminal work called Genograms, Assessment and Interventions, and there might be copies in the library of this, and if not, I certainly have lots of copies of this. McGoldrick really provided a detailed guide on how to construct, interpret, and use genograms in therapeutic settings. And McGoldrick's genograms go beyond mere representation of family members and their relationships. It really dives into the subtleties of family narratives, looking for where are the recurring conflicts, where are the alliances, where is there evidence of transmission of trauma or transmission of resilience across generations. And one of McGoldrick's most significant contributions to family therapy is her insistence on the importance of cultural context. She recognized early on that many family therapy models were developed within a Western framework and often failed to account for the diverse cultural backgrounds of families. And so she's really advocated for the inclusion of cultural, ethnic, and religious factors in the construction and interpretation of genograms. She's also done some very strong work with ethnicity and family therapy. I know for myself and my own family history, it has been a wonderful, insightful guide for me to just understand my own family, recognizing some of the patterns that we have and some of the beliefs that we have and the attitudes that we have that were very true in my family and actually caused a lot of problems. And in recognizing that these are simply, that not every family has these kind of thoughts and beliefs and practices, helped me to recognize that there are different and better ways of doing family in my own context. So, all that to say is that Monica McGoldrick is one of those people that you will want to be aware of in your professional life. She's one of the leading figures in family therapy, particularly in the use of genograms and the emphasis of cultural context. So, if you want to be taken seriously, if you want to become a supervisor, for example, in counseling, or be able to lead discussion groups with other counselors, or simply being able to focus on helping people with helping families, you will want to become an expert in genograms. It is a wonderful tool for helping us to move forward. Now, let's take a little bit of time and move on and dive into just a general introduction to systemic assessments in family therapy and kind of define what that is and why we do it. So, systemic assessments in family therapy really refers to some very structured and methodological approaches used by therapists to gather information primarily about family dynamics and relationships and how a family functions. And these assessments provide, ideally, a comprehensive overview of the family system, and it highlights areas where the family is strong and potential challenges that may contribute to issues that are presented in therapy. And so the primary purpose of systemic assessments is to offer therapists a clear and organized way to understand the complex interactions within a family. By systemically collecting and analyzing information, therapists can form hypotheses about the underlying causes of the family's difficulties and develop interventions that address these issues. Now, systemic assessments are they're essential for creating a therapeutic roadmap. You need to kind of know what the problems are and how the family is trying to function in order to figure out how to help the family, what directions to go and what to focus on. So a systemic assessment helps the therapist identify patterns of behavior, helps them to identify communication styles and emotional connections that are often not immediately apparent. And all of this information really is crucial for setting realistic goals and measuring progress throughout that whole therapeutic process. And mainly, the idea here is that it's important to have a holistic understanding of family dynamics. That's really central to any effective family therapy. Unlike approaches that focus solely on individual members, systemic assessments consider the whole family and acknowledge that the family as a whole is a powerful influence on each member's behavior and emotions. And we need to consider how all of this is interconnected and influenced by the larger system. So a holistic assessment allows therapists to see beyond surface level problems and to identify deeper systemic issues. So for example, a child's behavioral problems may be linked to unresolved conflicts between the parents or stressors that affect the entire family. And by understanding the family as a dynamic system, therapists can address these root causes rather than just treating symptoms. And so this approach also emphasizes the importance of context. Family dynamics are shaped by a range of factors, including cultural background, family's socioeconomic status, and different life events within the family, as well as events in the past. So systemic assessments really ensure that these contextual factors are taken into account. And so it provides a more accurate and nuanced understanding of the family situation. Moreover, a holistic perspective strengthens the resources of the family. It gives the family places where they can identify areas of concern, but also areas where they can improve. So overall, systemic assessments are a foundational element of family therapy. They offer a structured approach to understanding the complexities of family dynamics, and by adopting a holistic view, therapists can then develop a more effective intervention that really considers the entire family system and its unique context. Now, I don't realize I've been talking a lot about family system. So, and we'll be diving into that more and more, but I just want to kind of cover some of the basic tools that we use to start us off. And as we go on, it will all make a lot more sense as we move on through the course. But the basic idea that the family is a system, it's kind of like a machine. All the different parts need to be working together. And if one part is out, the machine still wants to work, and so it will start to adjust, but something will be wrong, and it will kind of make everything kind of not work quite so well. So when we do systemic family assessments, one of the first things that we do is we interview the family. So this really involves, what you would expect in therapy. We're having direct conversations with family members. We do this both individually. We can also do this as a group. And these interviews are really designed to gather information about the family history, about relationship dynamics, about communication patterns, and individual perspectives on the issues being addressed within therapy. Now, there are some strengths to this, and that is, first off, it allows for some real-time observation of how families interact and the different communication styles. It also provides some in-depth qualitative data, so we can pick up things about where are the emotional processing, what are the family narratives that are being lived out. And it also helps the therapist to develop some therapeutic rapport and build trust between the therapist and the family members. But there are some limitations. There's only so much information that families are willing to share openly, and that takes time to build that trust and be able to share. And there's also people wanting to put their best foot forward. There's that kind of social desirability bias where family members present themselves in the most favorable light. It's also very time consuming and may require multiple sessions in order to gather all of the data that you really feel that you need to understand what is going on within the family. And that's where questionnaires and self-report measures come in, because questionnaires and self-report measures are these kind of standardized tools that ask family members to respond to a series of questions or statements. And so these tools are designed to assess specific aspects of family functioning, such as communication, their roles, boundaries, and satisfaction with the family. And these are very efficient at gathering information from family members in a very structured way. And once you get comfortable using these tools, it gives you some real good practical information. And it allows you to compare family members and highlight any discrepancies in the different perceptions that family members have. And it's also standardized, so we can kind of see where this family is from normative data. How do they compare to the typical family and how the typical family functions? But again, there's some limitations to this that can be influenced by social desirability or a lack of insight into family dynamics. And it probably isn't going to capture all of the complexity of family interactions. So you have to kind of recognize that that's there. And the questions, because they're standardized, may not cover all of the relevant aspects of the family situation. So that's where you also want to do some behavioral observations. And behavioral observations are where the therapist is watching and noting family interactions in real time. You know, who's cutting off who's taking up the most time talking, who is stepping into the background, who is arguing with who. And the goal here is to observe how family members communicate, how they manage conflict, and how they express their emotions without relying upon any kind of self-report data. And the strength here is that it really provides some direct evidence of how family members interact. And so it helps you to catch things that you wouldn't normally capture through interviews or questionnaires. It also allows therapists to see patterns of behavior, such as power dynamics and alliances and avoidance strategies. And so this can be used as well to help you to adjust your interventions in real time. But you have to kind of recognize that there are some limitations here. First off, when you have a therapist in with the family, that kind of alters the behavioral dynamics a little bit. So that can skew your observations a little bit. Also, you really need to be a skilled observer to accurately interpret complex family dynamics. So it takes time to develop these skills. So while I encourage new counselors to try to practice this, rely a little bit more on the objective measures to start off with, because it takes a few years to start to develop your intuition about how things are going before you can really trust these kind of behavioral observations on their own. And then, of course, we have the genograms. And the genograms are that part of the assignment that I am assigning to you as an assignment because I want you to develop skills here. And what a genogram is really a visual representation of family relationships and histories that map out patterns across generations. And they are particularly useful for identifying things like intergenerational transmission of trauma, or transmission of certain behaviors or beliefs or roles, and also issues such as mental health problems or substance use problems or chronic illness. And so there are some strengths with this. It provides you with a very quick, easy visual summary of the complex family dynamics and history, so you can kind of review that every week when you're meeting with the family, and they can kind of review it too to understand how we want to change things. It helps you to identify patterns and connections that may not have been immediately obvious to the family. And it helps you to explore the impact of things like historical and cultural factors on the family. But again, like everything, there's some limitations. So it requires some significant amount of information. And sometimes that's not completely accurate. So you need to kind of be mindful that you need to do the best that you can. And it can feel very complex, particularly to a novice therapist. But as you become more used to this, really after about a year or two, if you're doing family assessments constantly, you will become an expert in genograms very quickly. And then you will realize just what a wonderful tool this is. And then there's also something called ecomaps. And ecomaps are kind of like depict the relationships between a family and their external environment. So like, what are their social networks? What are the community resources? What are the stressors to the family? And what an ecomap does is it helps the therapist to understand what's the broader context in which the family operates and how are external factors influencing family dynamics. And so this really highlights the external support systems as well as the external stressors that are impacting upon the family, and helps for identifying potential resources and areas for intervention. But it may oversimplify complex relationships between these environments, so you need to kind of really take your time with this. You don't want to just do this simply and quickly. Now, let's take a little bit of time and look through what a genogram is, how we kind of do a genogram. So, a genogram, remember, it's a graphical representation, basically, of a family tree. But it goes beyond your traditional family tree. You really want to go back several generations. And it also includes detailed information about relationships and behaviors and significant events within the family. So it typically will cover multiple generations and is used to visualize patterns such as hereditary conditions, psychological traits, relational dynamics, traumas, that sort of thing. Now, the concept of genograms was really kind of developed in the 1980s with Monica McGoldrick and Randy Gerson being two of the key figures in its popularization and its refinement. And building on the earlier work in family systems theory, particularly that of Murray Bowen, McGoldrick and Gerson recognized the need for a tool that could help therapists and families see the bigger picture of how past and present family dynamics which really influence individual and collective behaviors. And the genogram's roots can be traced back to the work of psychiatrists and social workers who began to explore family systems as interconnected units rather than focusing solely on the individual, which is kind of where traditional psychoanalysis and psychotherapy seem to always focus. So there was a shift from an individualistic approach to systematic, to a more systemic perspective that highlights the importance of understanding how the patterns and roles and behaviors that are passed down through generations impact us and how they can affect the overall family dynamics. Now, I want to kind of talk a little bit about how a genogram is different from a traditional family tree. In a traditional family tree, you basically have a genealogical chart that lists family members across generations. Typically, it'll show their names, their birth and their death dates, and direct relationships such as, parent and child or spouse connections. And it's primarily used to trace ancestry and doesn't really provide any information about the emotional or relational aspects of the family. Now, in contrast to that, genograms include a wealth of additional information that makes them far more useful in the therapeutic context. They use standardized symbols to represent various members, relationships, and significant events such as marriages, divorces, illnesses, and deaths. Importantly, genograms also illustrate the quality of relationships, whether they are close, conflicted, or distant. And they can also include details about the family members' roles, their behaviors, their psychological traits. So, for example, a genogram might show patterns of substance abuse or patterns of mental illness or chronic health conditions that seem to reoccur across generations. And it can also depict the emotional bonds between family members, such as, where are their alliances or where are their conflicts? And all of this can influence current family dynamics. And this added layer of information helps therapists and clients alike to see how historical and systemic factors contribute to present-day issues. And so there are some practical applications for genograms. First off, genograms allow therapists to visualize the complex family relationships and to identify patterns that might not be immediately apparent during a regular therapeutic conversation. So, for instance, a genogram can help reveal how unresolved conflicts between parents might be influencing their child's behavior, or how a family's history of trauma might be contributing to current relational difficulties. Another valuable thing is that the genogram really does help to identify intergenerational patterns. So by examining the genogram, therapists can identify these intergenerational patterns, such as the repetition of certain behavioral roles, like, who's going to be the scapegoat in the family or who's going to be the caregiver in this family, how that reoccurs across generations. And recognizing these patterns can really be pivotal in understanding the root causes of some family issues and developing effective interventions to help people to move out of what can really be rigid, unhealthy roles into something that is more flexible and more healthy for the family and the individual. And so the final thing here is that it helps to facilitate some family discussion, because genograms can really serve as kind of a neutral tool to facilitate discussions within the family. They provide some visual, very concrete representation of the family system So it's not just the therapist saying this, but they can look at it and think about it. And the family members can see their relationships and their behaviors from a new perspective. And this can be particularly useful in family sessions where difficult or very sensitive topics are being addressed. So, overall, what I'm trying to get across here is that genograms are a cornerstone of family therapy. They're very powerful in helping us to understand the complexities of family therapy. Now, I want to take a little bit of time and just explain a little bit about genograms, and particularly how do we construct genograms. And also, I want to help you to kind of understand a little bit of the symbols and structures used in genograms, because that's really essential for accurately representing family relationships and genders and generational patterns. And when we understand these symbols, then we can start to communicate better with other professionals, so that, if we're in a consulting relationship with other counselors, and we're talking about a family that is in difficulty, we can draw the genogram and everybody goes, oh yes, okay, I see what's going on now very quickly. It's very easy and very useful tool. So, some basic rules. Circles represent a female family member. Squares represent a male family member. Triangles are used to represent a pregnancy or a miscarriage or an abortion. A filled-in symbol indicates the death of a family member, and normally there'll be the date of death, and that'll often be noted on the inside or nearby the symbol. Diagonal lines through a symbol will denote a deceased family member. Now, as far as relationships go, how do we represent relationships? Well, let's talk about the marriage line. That is a horizontal line connecting two symbols. That indicates a marital relationship. And the line may also include a date to indicate the year of the marriage. Now, if there's a separation or divorce line, then it would be a broken or dashed line representing a separation, while 2 slashes through the marriage line indicates a divorce. And then you'll have dates of separation and divorce that can be noted there. You can also have a cohabitation line, which would be a dotted line connecting the 2 symbols. And this includes, indicates that the couple is living together without being married. You can have sibling lines, which are vertical lines descending from the parents' relationship line that connect to the children. And so this illustrates the sibling relationships. And you can have an adoption line, which is a dashed line descending from the parent relationship to the adopted child symbol. Then you can kind of express emotional relationships. So a close relationship would be represented by a solid line that is a double thickness. A distant relationship would be a dashed line that indicates a distant or estranged relationship. If you want a conflictual relationship, that would be a zigzag or a jagged line between 2 individuals. That symbolizes a conflictual relationship. If you have a cutoff relationship, then you have a line with a slash across it, and that represents a complete cutoff or lack of contact between 2 individuals. So, as far as representation of relationships in gender and generational patterns, genograms provide a detailed representation of the nature and the quality of the relationship of the family. So, by using the various lines and symbols that we've talked about, therapists can map out the emotional dynamics within family members. So, for instance, a genogram might show that a mother and a daughter have a close relationship, which would be a double thickness line, while the father and son are in conflict, which would be a zigzag or jagged line. And remember, gender is represented through the use of circles and squares. And so the visual distinction helps you to quickly identify gender dynamics within the family, such as what are the prevalence of certain roles or behaviors among females and males across generations. It also helps to identify generational patterns. And these might include repeated behaviors or roles or issues like substance use or mental health conditions or divorce. And that pattern across multiple generations will often very easily be seen. So by constructing a genogram that spans 3 or more generations, therapists can observe how these patterns have been transmitted over time and how they may be impacting the current family members. Now, in addition to mapping out the relationships, genograms can also be used to illustrate family roles, like who's the caretaker, who's the scapegoat, or different alliances, who was forming a coalition against other family members. So, for example, a genogram might show that a grandmother has taken on a caretaker role for her grandchildren, or that siblings are forming an alliance against one parent. So, how do we construct a genogram? Well, the first step is to gather the information. So, you want to, of course, have not only the names and relationships of family members, but also significant life events, emotional relationships, and behavioral patterns. So, therapists may use interviews or questionnaires or other assessment tools to gather this information. So, you're going to want to talk to your parents. You're going to want to talk to your grandparents. You're going to want to talk to your aunts and your uncles and your siblings to try to figure out what's going on within your own family as you do your genogram. And once the information is gathered, the therapist begins by placing the oldest generation at the top and then work their way down. So they're connecting individuals with the appropriate lines and symbols. And it's important to be meticulous in representing both the structural and the emotional aspects of the family relationships. And after the initial genogram is drawn, you can then review it with the family to ensure that it's accurate and that it's complete, because oftentimes family members will want to provide additional details or corrections that you can be incorporated into the final genogram. So I want to just talk a little bit now about how we focus on the process of identifying patterns in genograms, particularly those that reveal intergenerational transmission or behavioral roles or dynamics. Intergenerational transmission really refers to the way in which behaviors or roles or emotional responses and relational patterns are passed down from one generation to the next. And genograms provide really a powerful tool for visualizing these transmissions. They allow therapists and clients to see how historical dynamics influence present-day issues. And there are some fairly common transmitted patterns, one of which is substance abuse. Really, one of the most commonly identified patterns in genograms, and why we are studying genograms within this program at all, is that it really does show that there is a generational transmission of substance abuse across generations. A genogram might reveal, though, that there are multiple family members across different generations that struggled with alcohol or drug dependence. And so this can suggest a pattern that may be influenced by genetics or environmental factors or relational factors. But that's not the only thing it's good for. Genograms can also highlight patterns of mental health conditions such as depression or anxiety or schizophrenia that recur across generations. And so recognizing these patterns can help in understanding the genetic predispositions and environmental stressors that contribute to these conditions. Then there are patterns of relational dynamics such as enmeshment or disengagement or conflict that can also be traced through genograms. So, for instance, a pattern of being emotionally distant in relationships between fathers and sons might be identified. And this might shed some light on some current relational difficulties within the family. There can also be some mechanisms of transmission. So, modeling, for example. Family members often model behaviors that they observed or caught from previous generations. It's not like your parents took a degree in parenting in order to be a parent. They didn't. They just caught what they got from other people. That's why a course like this is so valuable. First time in the history of your family that someone's actually studied family, which is profoundly important. So, for example, children who grew up in a household where conflict is resolved through aggression may adopt similar strategies in their adult relationships. There can also be just unspoken role assignment. So families might expect certain people to be the caretaker, others to be the peacemaker, others to be blamed for everything. And a genogram might reveal that the eldest daughter, for example, in a generation, has taken on the role of family caretaker, potentially leading to stress and burnout. It can also help to identify some unresolved trauma. Because trauma experienced by generations such as war or abuse or migration or disenfranchisement can be transmitted to subsequent generations through different behaviors and attitudes and even epigenetic changes in the person's DNA. And so a genogram can help identify how unresolved trauma impacts current family members. So it's important when you do a genogram to look at themes like addiction, to look for addiction patterns that can identify, and these are typically identified by noting symbols or annotations that indicate substance use disorders across generations. We like to see the frequency and reoccurrence of these issues, and that can point to patterns that might be deeply ingrained in the family system. And so by understanding the prevalence of addiction within a family, that can really guide some therapeutic interventions aimed to break the cycle of addiction. It can also help family members understand the roots of their struggles and develop strategies for change. Genograms can often reveal clusters of mental health issues such as depression or anxiety or bipolar disorder, particularly when multiple family members across different generations exhibit similar symptoms. And this pattern may suggest a genetic predisposition or a family environment that exacerbates this condition. And so by recognizing these patterns, it allows for more comprehensive treatment plans that can address both the individual symptoms and the broader family dynamics that contribute to mental health issues. And of course, there's the relational dynamics. So relational patterns such as conflict or enmeshment, which is, there isn't a boundary between two people, or detachment, where all there is boundaries between two people, can be identified by analyzing the lines and symbols represented in the relationships of the genogram. So, for example, a zigzag line between multiple generations of parents and children may indicate a recurring pattern of conflict that should be addressed and worked on and be a focus of treatment. So understanding these relational dynamics is really essential for addressing communication issues, emotional distance, or unresolved conflict within the family. Now, how do genograms help systemic issues within the family? Well, first off, it helps the family to visualize their dynamics. It helps also the therapist to visualize the complex family dynamics that may not be immediately apparent through just basic intervention or interviews or observations alone. So, for example, a genogram might reveal patterns of what we call triangulation, where a third person member is drawn into a conflict between two other members, and they kind of serve a role as both stabilizing or exacerbating the situation. They can also help to identify roles and boundaries. So genograms can highlight the roles that family members play within the system. Are they a mediator? Are they a caretaker? And these roles often become entrenched over time and contribute to dysfunction, because when roles become rigid, they are not flexible enough in order to meet the needs of the family. So genograms can reveal where boundaries are too rigid or too weak, too diffuse, where no one's really doing this role. And all of that can affect the overall functioning of the family. It can help to in uncovering intergenerational patterns. We don't want to repeat cycles of abuse or substance dependence or mental illness, so it helps to identify some of this. And maybe there's some past unresolved issues that continue to impact the family dynamics. It can also highlight emotional connections or distances. Are there close bonds, or are there conflicts or emotional cutoffs? What's the relationships like within the family? And helping to see those can help to identify what are the kinds of things that we need to work on. The other valuable thing that genograms do is it helps to hypothesize about the family functioning. Why are people experiencing things the way that they are? What are the patterns? What are the cutoffs? What are the generational influences? And we can then test some of these hypotheses by looking at the genogram, by discussing the genogram with the family. And this will then guide our intervention. So based on the insights that are gained by the genogram, therapists can start to develop some targeted interventions aimed at altering the dysfunctional patterns. So, for example, if a genogram reveals that a family has a history of triangulating a child into marital conflict, the therapist might work on strengthening the couple's direct communication and setting boundaries to protect the child from being drawn into their disputes. Now, of course, another thing that we want to do is to incorporate cultural context into genograms and really acknowledge the cultural factors in genograms, which allows the therapist to gain a deeper understanding of how cultural norms and values and traditions can influence the family dynamics. And some things to kind of remember here is that every family operates within a cultural framework that shapes their beliefs and behaviors and interactions. And sometimes it's important to work with families with different cultural backgrounds so that you start to understand the differences there. And these cultural norms and values are going to influence family roles, decision-making processes, communication styles, and even the meaning of certain behaviors. So, for example, in some cultures, the extended family plays a very significant role in daily life, while in others, just the nuclear family are the most common and prioritized relationships. So, when creating a genogram, it's really essential to consider how these cultural factors influence the family system. And this includes understanding the family's attitudes towards issues like gender, authority, conflict resolution, emotional expression. It also is going to look at immigration and acculturalization. When a family is immigrating somewhere, or when there's significant cultural change, this can cause stressors such as language barriers, such as economic hardship or cultural dislocation, which can affect the family relationship. And understanding this can go a long ways. Also, religion and spirituality often play a very important role in shaping family values and practices and coping mechanisms. And these beliefs can influence how families interpret life events, their approach to parenting, and their methods for dealing with stress or conflict. So, including religious and spiritual beliefs in the genogram can provide insights into the moral and ethical frameworks guiding the family's decisions and their interactions. So, when constructing a genogram, it can be important to note the religious affiliations of family members. Any significant religious milestones, say, for example, baptisms or marriages or funerals, and the role of religion in the family's daily life. So, understanding these things, or the absence of them, can go a long ways to seeing different roles within the family. And so it's important to remember to be flexible and adaptive with the genogram so that it reflects the cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity of the family. So, for example, some cultures have a specific kinship term or rule, like godparent or eldest son, that are important and that need to be represented accurately within the genogram. So you might want to use some colors or labels there. The other thing you want to be mindful of is to understand extended family networks and community supports and cultural practices that can be significant sources of resilience for the family. One final note here is that the therapist should always be aware of their own cultural biases and assumptions, because you come from a specific worldview and have your own expectations of what makes for a good or bad family. And we need to recognize that this is a bias when creating and interpreting genograms. And so it's important to grow throughout your career to understand that there is no perfect family. There are good ways of doing things and bad ways of doing things, and healthy ways of doing things and unhealthy ways of doing things. And what may be healthy in one context may be unhealthy in another. And so it's important to be mindful of that and to just kind of understand all of that and be flexible, is what I'm trying to say, with your understanding. Now, there are always some ethical considerations that we want to be mindful of when doing these kinds of things. So confidentiality is, of course, one of those. Confidentiality is a cornerstone of ethical practice in family therapy. So when creating genograms and conducting these systemic assessments, therapists are collecting detailed and often very sensitive information about family members, including their relationships, their mental health issues, and personal histories. And it's imperative that this information is kept confidential and is only shared with the consent of the family members involved. So therapists need to establish very clear agreements with families regarding who will have access to the genogram and the information it contains. And this is particularly important in cases where multiple family members are involved in therapy, as there may be differing views on how this information should be shared. And so involved within this is informed consent. That's a very crucial thing to think about before beginning the process of creating a genogram or conducting any systemic assessment. Therapists must ensure that all family members understand the purpose of the genogram, what information will be collected, how it will be used, and any potential risks involved. And this includes explaining how the genogram might reveal sensitive or previously unknown information that really could affect the family dynamics. So this consent should not only be done at the beginning, it should be an ongoing process where the therapist is checking in with family members as the genogram is evolving. Of course, you want to have this informed consent documented at the beginning so that you are documenting that you are following good professional practice, but then continue to check in. And again, we need to be mindful of our own biases. We may have our own expectations of what makes for a good family. And sometimes we have expectations of what other families are like, and we need to be mindful for things like confirmation bias, where we expect to find something, and when we see indications of it, we go, aha, and we think that we have all the answers when we really don't. The other thing to kind of be mindful of here is that the family is an autonomous unit. They are going to have painful aspects of their family history, such as infidelity or abuse or mental illness. And it's important to help family members feel comfortable sharing their experiences without fear of judgment or exposure, because these things can do some significant harm, and we need to be mindful of that as well. So be guided by our understanding of potential risks and harm, and be guided by good ethical decision making. Next, we're going to dive into how do we analyze genograms and identify family dynamics. So when interpreting a genogram, the first step is to look for recurring patterns and themes. These might be repeated behaviors such as addiction or conflict that occur across generations. So, for example, a pattern of divorce or separation might indicate unresolved relational issues that are passed down through the family. Another common theme to look for is the transmission of roles, such as peacemaker or scapegoat. So identifying these roles can help the therapist to understand how individual family members are positioned within the family system and how these roles influence their behavior and their relationships, because they will impact the person on an individual level. And when we understand the roles and boundaries represented in the genogram, we can see, who's the authoritative figure, who's the rebel. And boundaries are essential aspects of family dynamics. So in a genogram, boundaries might be represented by the closeness or distance between family members. So for instance, if the genogram shows overly close relationships, or what we call enmeshment, between some family members and distant relationships with others, this might point to boundary issues that need to be addressed in therapy. All of this can go a long ways to help us to hypothesize about the family, to develop targeted strategies, and to facilitate some family discussion. Now, let's just close out our lecture here with a few definitions. What is a genogram? Well, a genogram is a visual representation, basically, of a family tree that goes really beyond the basic structural of familial relationships to include detailed information about the relationships, behaviors, and significant events within the family. It typically spans multiple generations, and it's used in family therapy to identify patterns and roles and dynamics that influence the current family system. So, genograms are essential for uncovering things like intergenerational patterns, such as recurring mental health issues, conflict, relationship problems, substance abuse, things like that. When we talk about intergenerational transmission, that really refers to the process by which different roles or emotional responses or relational patterns are passed down from one generation to the next within a family. We catch what is normal, what we think is normal, based upon our own experiences. And so these transmissions can be both positive and negative. We inherit coping strategies, but we also perpetuate dysfunctional behaviors. And then when we talk about emotional cutoff, that really refers to the process by where an individual attempts to manage the unresolved emotional issues with family members simply by reducing or completely cutting off emotional contact with them. And this can manifest itself in physical distance, minimal communication, or internal emotional disconnection. And this is important to recognize because families should be, in an ideal world, a place where there is health and love and care and support, not unresolved tension and conflict. But understanding family dynamics can go a long way to help to foster healthier emotional connections. And closing out our test question, what's the best way to describe the primary purpose of a genogram in family therapy? And I would say that it's probably to visualize family relationships and identify intergenerational patterns that influence current family dynamics. So, a few things that I hope you take away from this lecture. As we've discussed systemic assessments, and particularly genograms, hope that you recognize that these are really invaluable tools for understanding the complexities of family systems. Hope you've got some sense now of how to construct a genogram, how to identify patterns, and interpret the information to inform therapeutic interventions. As well as remember that there is importance in understanding the religious, the cultural, and the ethical context when we're using these tools. So as future family therapists, your ability to navigate and interpret complex family dynamics really will be central to your success in helping families heal and to grow. And so by using genograms and other systemic assessment tools, they're not just tools, they are a pathway to a deeper understanding and a means to help you to make meaningful change in people's lives. So I hope you remember that and just have enjoyed this lecture. And I will see you next week. You take care. Bye-bye.